I ask all of our guests to please take their seats. The Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations will now come to order. Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Welcome to today's hearing for the Energy and Commerce Committee's Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. We depend on our electric infrastructure for many of the activities essential to our daily life: heating and cooling our homes, powering industrial operations, operating medical equipment, and treating our water supply. Unfortunately, days or even hours without electricity can have devastating consequences, as some of my constituents experienced firsthand last December when Southwest Virginia suffered from extremely low temperatures and some power outages and rolling blackouts. Securing our electric infrastructure is an increasingly demanding and complicated challenge. Given novel threats from foreign groups and governments and the increased complexity of our critical infrastructure, in May of 2021, a cyber criminal group's ransomware attack struck the Colonial Pipeline Company and led to a proactive shutdown of the company's pipeline system, which in turn caused fuel shortages on the East Coast. Our foreign adversaries have also demonstrated an increasing interest in their ability to undermine our critical infrastructure and strengthening their cyber capabilities. According to the Director of National Intelligence, Russia will continue to focus on improving its ability to target critical infrastructure in the United States. And China is likely capable of cyber attacks that could disrupt our infrastructure. In fact, just last week, reports emerged that Chinese-backed hackers have infiltrated email accounts at the State Department and the Department of Commerce. The proliferation of so-called Internet of Things or smart devices, anything from your television to an electric car, raises new risks for our electric grid. The implications on grid security have not been fully fleshed out. Additionally, last December, the Environmental Protection Agency published proposed greenhouse gas standards for fossil fuel-fired power plants, which could burden dependable resources such as coal and natural gas and force generation facilities offline, jeopardizing reliable baseload power. I have joined many of my colleagues in fighting back against these rulemakings and will continue to demand answers regarding this aggressive rulemaking onslaught. Further, last year, the Department of Energy proposed new energy efficiency standards for distribution transformers, which I believe would severely exacerbate already serious supply chain constraints for this equipment. This is terrible timing on the Department of Energy's part. To combat this supply chain threat and potential danger to our grid, I'm an original co-sponsor of Congressman Hudson's legislation, the Protecting America's Distribution Transformer Supply Chain Act. That bill prevents the Department of Energy from implementing new distribution transformer standards for 5 years. Probing federal efforts to secure our critical infrastructure, exploring risks that need further attention, and identifying opportunities to enhance cooperation among stakeholders is an important task for this subcommittee. To that end, on May 16th of this year, I convened a hearing to examine the work of 3 of our sector-specific agencies in protecting their respective critical infrastructure sectors from cyber threats. At the hearing, members of this subcommittee questioned the Director of the Department of Energy's Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response on the Department's efforts to secure energy systems and coordinate with energy infrastructure operators to accomplish this shared goal. I hope we can build on that discussion today. We have more infrastructure security experts with us today to share their knowledge with us. First, we welcome Mr. Manny Cancel of the Electric Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or ISAC. ISAC compiles and analyzes security data for the electric industry, coordinates incident management, and circulate mitigation strategies among the various stakeholders. Also joining us is Mr. Sam Chanowski of the Idaho National Laboratory. As part of the Department of Energy's National Lab Complex, Idaho National Laboratory hosts research and testing to strengthen the electric grid and critical infrastructure security, among other activities. We also welcome the Honorable Bruce Walker, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Alliance for Critical Infrastructure Security, and who formerly served as Assistant Secretary for Energy at the Department of Energy. Finally, we also are joined by the Honorable Dr. Paul Stockton of Paul Stockton LLC, who formerly served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense. Our witnesses here with us today offer a wealth of experience in the cybersecurity, national security, and electric infrastructure fields, and we appreciate them sharing their expertise with us today. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the witnesses being here, and I look forward to us having a positive and productive discussion today. And with that, I yield back and now recognize Ms. Castor, the ranking member of the subcommittee, for her 5-minute opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chair Griffith. Thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. The electric grid is essential in each and every one of our lives, but it is under stress. At the outset of the June 2023 North America Electric Reliability Corporation report, NERC advises that extreme weather events continue to pose the greatest risk to reliability due to the increase in frequency, footprint, duration, and severity. In 2022, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration identified 18 separate billion-dollar weather-related disasters in the United States. Climate change is no longer an emerging threat to the grid. It is wreaking havoc today. The increase in extreme weather, record temperatures, droughts in places that rely on hydropower, and excessive precipitation in others present an incredibly complex challenge. This summer, many Americans are sweltering in record heat and grappling with flash floods. The warnings are all around us, and they highlight the imperative that the power generation system move urgently from fossil fuels to clean energy. And that in itself adds to the complexity of ensuring that the grid is reliable as well. Plus, threats from physical attacks and cyber attacks are a growing concern. NERC advises that hostile nation states and domestic extremists are targeting our grid. In 2018, it was revealed that Russian government hackers had spent years gaining access to parts of our energy grid, including Wolf Creek Nuclear Power Plant's business network. Between 2011 and 2013, hackers backed by China's government breached networks at 20 oil and gas pipelines, and details that were declassified in 2021 indicate that hackers plan to use the network access to control and damage physical pipeline infrastructure across America. Since 2016, federal agencies and researchers have warned about and documented an exponential rise in domestic extremist groups, particularly white supremacists, threatening and attacking grid infrastructure. In February, the FBI thwarted a white supremacist plot to cause a citywide blackout in Baltimore by attacking grid substations and triggering a cascading grid failure. Then in April, 2 white supremacists were sentenced in connection to a plot to carry out coordinated attacks on grid substations in order to stoke civil unrest and racial resentment. For all of these reasons, the Democratic-led Congress and President Biden passed the most important investments in grid reliability in history in 2021 and 2022. The landmark Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act direct major investments to grid reliability, while speeding the energy transition and lowering costs for consumers through energy efficiency that can take the pressure off the power generation system. DOE's Grid Deployment Office already has awarded $300 million in grants to improve grid resilience and has very significant resources left to implement. The bipartisan infrastructure law provided billions to secure our energy grid and improve resilience and efficiency. Grant initiatives created by the law are investing billions of dollars in partnerships with states, tribes, utilities, and other grid organizations to enhance the reliability and resilience of grid infrastructure. Other grants are investing more than $15 billion to harden and weatherize the grid against the worsening effects of climate change, such as flooding and droughts and wildfires. Investments of more than $1 billion for cybersecurity ensure we are mitigating the risk of cyber threats so that our grid can use the most cutting-edge technologies. Taking a look at where these grants are being deployed, I noticed South Carolina, Kentucky, Indiana, Idaho, Pennsylvania, North Dakota, so these grants are getting out there, but we've got to do more in partnership with our local communities. Laws passed last Congress also include provisions that tackle high household energy costs. And I just have to vent a little bit here. You know, a lot of the energy efficiency really helps take pressure off the grid. It helps us combat the higher cost of climate change. And I am very frustrated, maybe you all can help, that Governor DeSantis vetoed over $346 million for energy efficiency improvement rebates for my neighbors back home, energy efficient home appliance purchases, and $7 million for a training program for electrification contractors that would help expand desperately needed contractors that support the state's booming growth and help train the workforce that we need to harden the grid. So hopefully we can work together moving forward in a bipartisan way. It's more critical than ever that we strengthen the grid from climate change and bad actors. I'm looking forward to your input today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chairman yields back. Now recognize the chairwoman of the full committee, Ms. McMorris Rodgers, for her 5 minutes of opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Griffith. Protecting America's access to affordable, reliable energy is a top priority for the Energy and Commerce Committee. Energy is foundational to everything: our way of life, a strong economy, and our national security. For a more prosperous and secure future, we must safeguard our electrical grid from external threats like cyber attacks, physical attacks, and other disturbances. Our electric grid is a crucial component of our daily life, transporting and delivering energy to where it is needed. It powers our homes, businesses, and other critical infrastructure such as hospitals, communications networks, and water systems. Threats to the grid are threats to people's lives, health, safety, and their economic prosperity. I know that was underscored to all our members who participated in our grid security field hearing in Moore County, North Carolina, a few weeks ago. Physical attacks on the U.S. power grid reportedly rose by 71% last year as compared to the previous year. Cyber risk to energy systems are increasing, and the Director of National Intelligence has confirmed both Russia and the Chinese Communist Party are capable of launching cyber attacks that could disrupt critical energy services. Just this month, we received another jarring reminder that enemies are both willing and able to infiltrate our systems and access our most sensitive information. Reports emerged earlier this week that hackers in China breached email accounts at 24 organizations, including the U.S. Departments of State and Commerce. Attacks like this embolden China. Imagine what is possible if the CCP attacks and hacks our grid. This could shut down power to key national security facilities like military bases. They could prevent power from getting to hospitals, cause widespread blackouts, and prevent critical energy resources from getting to the people that need it the most. It is vital that we secure our critical energy infrastructure from those threats, especially as those systems become more and more complex. Increased interconnectivity of our electric systems creates more vulnerabilities and opportunities for adversaries to infiltrate our critical infrastructure and inflict widespread damage. These dangerous threats to our grid is why this committee reported out H.R. 1160, Rep. Wahlberg and Rep. Schreier's Critical Electric Infrastructure and Cybersecurity Incident Reporting Act back in February. While securing such a vast, complicated network of electric infrastructure is a daunting task, it's a necessary one. Lives depend on it. Bad actors, both at home and abroad, have been refining their capabilities to compromise and damage and identify vulnerabilities in our electrical systems. It's time to have a real conversation about how we can harden our energy grid and enhance its resiliency to better protect it from all kinds of attacks, as well as equipment shortages and other potential risk. The goal of today's oversight hearing is to hear from experts on how we can work together to bolster the security of electric infrastructure and be prepared for increasingly sophisticated threats. America is home to exceptional innovators, electric infrastructure operators with valuable on-the-job expertise and other experts who have dedicated their careers to infrastructure security. Open and frequent communication between our government, utilities, and other stakeholders will help us better prepare for and respond to rapidly evolving threats in an increasingly challenging security environment. I appreciate our witnesses for being here today. We look forward to hearing your expertise and helping inform Congress's efforts to protect our constituents and the infrastructure that they depend on. I look forward to today's discussion. Yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our nation's energy grid is critical infrastructure that we rely on every day in virtually every aspect of our lives. We depend on it for the production, transmission, and delivery of electricity, and we expect that every time we flip the switch that our lights will turn on and that we can cool or heat our homes, including during extreme weather events. Today, the subcommittee is examining threats to our electric energy infrastructure. The climate crisis is creating unprecedented challenges and risks that threaten our grid's integrity. Extreme weather events are happening more frequently and in regions that are not necessarily prepared for them. Earlier this month, we experienced the hottest week in recorded history. The number of days each year when we experience extreme heat has also risen dramatically in just the past few years and is projected to continue rising. Winter storms have also become more extreme and unpredictable and have knocked out power for millions during dangerously cold days. Extremely high or low temperatures significantly strain our energy grid by increasing demand for air conditioning or heat, while simultaneously decreasing the overall efficiency of some power plants and grid infrastructure. Other forms of extreme weather are also straining the grid. Torrential downpours and heavy rainfall have become more common and can cause flooding that can damage grid infrastructure and cause outages. The critical role that the energy grid plays in our day-to-day lives also makes it a target for bad actors and foreign adversaries. Regardless of how it happens, losing power for any period of time can upend our lives without warning. Our grid faces threats both from physical attacks and cyber attacks. In recent years, hackers have come close to gaining access to our energy infrastructure. There's also been a disturbing rise in the number of physical attacks on grid substations, and the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have warned about the increase in white supremacist plots targeting the power grid. When we're caught unprepared, power outages can have a tragic human cost, and that's why the investments Democrats made last Congress are so important. The bipartisan infrastructure law invested billions in grid resilience and cybersecurity efforts that will make our grid more secure and resilient in the face of the climate crisis and security threats. These investments are meant to help our grid at every level. For example, the law invests more than $15 billion to harden and weatherize our energy grid. The Department of Energy has also already awarded more than $300 million in grants to states, tribes, utilities, and other organizations to support grid resilience at the state and local levels. And we didn't stop there. The Inflation Reduction Act will bolster supply chains, boost domestic manufacturing, and strengthen the critical infrastructure sectors that our grid needs to operate effectively and bounce back quickly after an outage. These investments also enhanced past bipartisan efforts to protect the energy grid and ensure that federal regulators have the tools they need to respond to emerging threats. In 2015, Congress unanimously passed the bipartisan FAST Act in response to brazen attacks on grid substations. This law gave the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission additional flexibility to mount a more robust response to physical security threats. More recently, the Energy Act of 2020 enhanced grid security, efficiency, and reliability through incentives to accelerate research and deployment of smart grids and other innovative technologies. This committee has a long history of working together on grid security and resilience, and we must continue that bipartisan work for the American people. Our grid faces a wide range of constantly evolving threats, and the federal government must have the tools needed to meet that challenge. And I hope we can work together on these important goals, and I want to thank the witnesses, I should say, for being here as we examine where we need to go from here. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. That concludes members' opening statements. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' written opening statements will be made a part of the record. Please provide those to the clerk promptly. We want to thank our witnesses for being here today and taking the time to testify before our subcommittee. You will have the opportunity to give an opening statement followed by a round of questions from members. Our witnesses today are Mr. Manny Cancel, Chief Executive Officer of the Electric Information Sharing and Analysis Center and Senior Vice President of North American Reliability Corporation. Sam Chanowski, the Technical Relationship Manager, Idaho National Laboratory. The Honorable Bruce Walker, President and Chief Security Officer, Alliance for Critical Infrastructure Security. Inc., and the Honorable Paul N. Stockton, Senior Fellow, Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. We appreciate you being here today, and I look forward to hearing from each of you. As you are aware, this committee is holding an oversight hearing, and when doing so, we have the practice of taking our testimony or taking the testimony under oath. Do any of you have an objection to taking testimony under oath today? Seeing no objection, we will proceed. The chair would also advise you that you're entitled to be advised by counsel pursuant to House rules. Do any of you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today? Seeing that all have responded that they do not desire counsel, if you all would each please rise and raise your right hand. Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? And you all may be seated. Seeing that the witnesses have all answered in the affirmative, you are now sworn in and under oath and subject to the penalties set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. With that, we will now recognize Mr. Manny Counsel for 5 minutes to give his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, and the members of the subcommittee for inviting me and convening this very important examination of threats to the nation's electric grid. The Electricity Information Sharing and Analysis Center, EISAC, is the clearinghouse for security information for the electricity industry in North America. It is operated by NERC, the organization designated as the Electricity Reliability Organization for the United States. Our mission is to reduce cyber and physical security risks to the electricity industry across the continent by providing unique insights, leadership, and collaboration. We accomplish our mission by sharing threat information that we receive from our members and other sources in a timely and actionable manner with asset owners and operators to mitigate the complex, evolving threats to the grid. The EISAC operates a 24/7 watch operation, develops expert analysis of ongoing incidents, and provides a suite of analytical products and services accessible to over 1,700 members. We work closely with the Department of Energy, DHS, CISA, FERC, and other federal agencies, and maintain similar partnerships in Canada. NERC and the EISAC are members of the industry's Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, ESCC, and help to operationalize their security initiatives. The EISAC also plays a key role in cross-sector coordination, focusing on interdependent sectors including oil, natural gas, water, finance, and telecommunications. NERC's mandatory security standards for the bulk power system provide a common, robust foundation for security, complementing the EISAC's activities. Let me turn to the threat environment before describing more about how the EISAC addresses security threats. While there have been no major outages resulting from a cyber attack in the United States, the threat landscape is complex and includes continuously evolving and persistent threats from sophisticated, capable adversaries. Among the most advanced are nation-states, which possess the capability to disrupt critical infrastructure in North America. Numerous reports underscore the severity of these threats. Aided by a significant increase in software and hardware vulnerabilities, adversaries are constantly looking for ways to exploit the electricity sector. Chinese cyber activities are one of the most dynamic cyber threats. China continues to demonstrate increasing sophistication, including new and adaptive techniques to gain access to networks, as demonstrated by the recent Volt Typhoon campaign targeting U.S. military and critical infrastructure companies. Russia also remains a top cyber threat as it refines and employs espionage, influence, and attack capabilities. And Iran and North Korea show growing expertise and willingness to conduct aggressive cyber operations. Ransomware attacks continue to target the electricity industry and their service providers, including the recent CLOP ransomware campaign, which has also impacted many critical infrastructure sectors. Similarly, the physical security environment remains quite challenging. While most incidents have not impacted the grid, we saw a cluster of incidents in North Carolina and Washington State last year, and the foiled plot to attack electricity infrastructure in Baltimore, all which are very concerning. The EISAC employs numerous tools to effectively address threats to the grid. These include a secure portal through which members exchange and receive threat warnings, mitigations, and analytical products. Timely bulletins and alerts on urgent threats, including mitigations. Some alerts require responses regarding the actions taken to mitigate these threats. In partnership with DOE, we maintain the Cybersecurity Risk Information Sharing Program, CRISP. CRISP is a monitoring system that provides cyber threat intelligence and detects malicious activities. Information from CRISP is shared widely across the electricity sector. It has proven highly effective in detecting and preventing potential attacks. We also partner with DOE on the Energy Threat Analysis Center, ETAC. ETAC is a collaboration between government and industry through CISA's Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. ETAC partners meet regularly to review threats, provide industry context and recommendations to the electricity sector. Recent matters that the ETAC has collaborated on include the war in Ukraine, supply chain events, Volt Typhoon, and other operational technology vulnerabilities. The EISAC partners with the vendor community to discuss security issues with firms that supply products to our sector. We conduct GridX, the largest grid security exercise in North America, and we host a widely attended security conference which provides training and education for the industry. In conclusion, the EISAC employs a comprehensive suite of tools and partnerships to help the industry defend against a range of persistent, sophisticated, and evolving threats. I look forward to our discussion, and thank you again for inviting me.
Mr. Chanowski.
Thank you, Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, and members of the subcommittee. I thank you for holding this hearing and inviting Idaho National Laboratory's testimony on emerging threats to our electric energy systems. Our nation's electric energy infrastructure is the foundation for societal health and safety, a vibrant economy, and national security. And it has become a contested space in the perpetual competition against those who seek to harm our nation. This comes as we're entering a period of unprecedented technical and policy changes affecting the grid as we continue the transition to a decarbonized, decentralized, and more digitized system of systems. I'm a technical relationship manager and program developer at INL. In this capacity, I provide technical leadership, expertise, and strategic insights to a portfolio of critical infrastructure security and resilience programs from the Departments of Energy, Homeland Security, and Defense. Throughout my career, I have had an uncommonly broad and sometimes deep perspective from which I've seen and studied the evolution of the threats to our electric grids. While my esteemed colleagues will be each discussing some particular threats to our electric systems and some mitigation options from their perspectives, I'd like to offer a framework for how to examine these threats. We typically express security risk in a simple sentence. A threat exploits vulnerabilities to impose consequences. Threats are those external sources of harm. Typically for security, these are sentient humans and organizations, and they must have the capability, the opportunity, and the intent in order to pose a credible threat. Vulnerabilities, or as I prefer to think of them, latent weaknesses, are flaws in people, processes, and technology that a threat can take advantage of to inflict harm in some way. And consequence, the harm itself, is perhaps the easiest to understand, remembering that it's expressed in terms of magnitude and its ultimate duration. Decomposing the risk in this way is helpful because there's different kinds of interventions that have different responsible and accountable parties. When we think of talking of understanding the threats, remediating existing vulnerabilities, and also preventing the introduction of new vulnerabilities, and reducing the consequences, having this model of what comprises risk is useful to understand how to best tailor our actions. In my written testimony, I provided a graphic that shows several different threats to electric energy infrastructure, plotted by their potential consequences versus their frequency of realization. I categorize these as security threats, natural hazards, policy and economic circumstances, and technical system threats. And we do this plotting exercise, we can see three different clusters of risks emerge. On the vertical asymptote are high consequence, low frequency threats, sometimes called HILF or black swan events. These are things like targeted sabotage, insider threat, extreme weather, and cyber attacks targeting operational technology or industrial control systems. Strategies to manage these risks aim for survival and resilience, but they also include certain no-risks approaches that will add value even if the risks are never realized. And by comparison, on the horizontal asymptote of this plotting exercise, we find the sort of threats that we deal with every day, like weather, failed equipment, simple vandalism. Using automation and technology, whether it's in the form of well-tuned security appliances in a well-thought-out and proper system architecture, or self-healing electric grid infrastructure to automatically isolate faults and restore customers, is an effective strategy against these constant threats. Standards-based approaches provide a good complement for automation for both security and reliability. And at the D of the curve, we find those threats whose impacts are high enough to merit attention, but well short of catastrophic, and which occur frequently enough so we can identify and understand trends in them. And this is where we can understand the nature of these threats and the vulnerabilities that they exploit, and we can design good barriers and guardrails to reduce the consequences of future threats. This is how we can improve from where we are today. My colleagues at INL take great pride in addressing the nation's biggest challenges. The cyber-informed engineering, or CIE, approach and mindset, as applied through our consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering, or CCE, methodology, are two high-impact programs to counter existing and emerging threats to critical infrastructures and critical functions, including electric energy systems. I appreciate this opportunity to share some of my experience with you in this hearing and look forward to your questions.
Thank the gentleman, and now recognize Mr. Walker for his 5 minutes opening statement.
Thank you. Chair Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, and distinguished members of this committee. My name is Bruce Walker. I'm the former Assistant Secretary for the Office of Electricity in the Department of Energy. Today, I am the president of the nonprofit Alliance for Critical Infrastructure Security, ACES. ACES' key mission is to facilitate the collaboration between critical infrastructure stakeholders to identify and evaluate cyber and physical risk vulnerabilities and develop solutions to improve the security of the nation's most critical infrastructure with an emphasis on the electric grid. The most important evolving threat to the electric grid is associated with cybersecurity and physical security, and the potential impact has been increased by the changing electric generation fleet. The 2023 Annual Threat Assessment of the Intelligence Community highlights a significant nation-state capability that threatens our electric grid without mentioning the grid. Specifically, quote, China almost certainly is capable of launching cyber attacks that could disrupt critical infrastructure services within the United States, including against oil and gas and railroad services. Let me connect some dots. The electric grid is now highly reliant upon gas transmission pipelines. Over the past 15 years, we have more than doubled our reliance on gas pipeline infrastructure for gas-fired generation. In fact, just yesterday, across the continental United States, 46% of the generation fleet was gas-fired. In addition, 7 of the 13 regions that are monitored were above 50%. And 3 of those 7 were above 60%, with the highest being 66%. That is a huge reliance on natural gas-fired power for the United States. Today, the loss of critical infrastructure pipelines in the U.S. would result in significant loss of gas-fired generation. And depending on the circumstances of the event, may be enough loss of generation to actually change and create a mismatch of capacity and load on the system. As a result, in an effort to protect itself, the electric grid, using a process known as under-frequency load shedding, would, without any human intervention, shed large tranches of load in seconds. Under-frequency load shedding is a method the industry has relied upon for decades to suppress degradation of the system in order to save the whole. Essentially, what was a brilliant and effective engineering pre-cyber, pre-physical threat tool has become our Achilles heel. Turning towards physical threat, a recent example illustrates that there are those who are focused on destroying large power transformers using physical force. The lack of available spares, coupled and compounded with our inability to produce these within the United States in a sufficient number or procure them quick enough from other countries, creates a serious reliability and resilience challenge, particularly if a large number of these transformers were to be destroyed. And the fact that domestic violent extremists are focusing in on destroying these large power transformers remarkably increases the probability of this threat. Industry must continue to work in partnership with the FBI, DOE, DHS, and others to be vigilant against this physical threat. Neither the cyber nor physical threats of the United States that in the electric grid is facing can be fully addressed through industry efforts or federal government partnerships as they exist today. To successfully protect infrastructure, we must approach this problem differently. We must transition to an all-of-society approach, an approach that, among other things, uses appropriately federal capabilities to protect the grid, especially the electric grid throughout the United States that's rapidly transforming. Over the past decade, critical infrastructure asset owners were not expected nor responsible to defend against nation-state adversaries nor domestic violent extremists. In fact, protection against these threats was the role of the federal government. We now need to leverage the capabilities within the federal government to strengthen our at-risk critical infrastructure. The Alliance for Critical Infrastructure Security was specifically formed to facilitate the necessary collaboration to build an alliance resulting in an all-of-society approach between the federal government and their private sector asset owner counterparts. I look forward to answering any questions you may have regarding the emerging threats to the electric grid. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize Mr. Stockton for his 5-minute opening statement.
Chair Griffith, Ranking Member Castor. Okay, let's try this. Try it again. Chair Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, and members of the committee, thank you for the honor of testifying today. As you highlighted in your opening remarks, the grid faces increasingly severe threats. These threats stem in part from the growing capabilities of China and other potential adversaries to attack our grid. But there's a second factor. The grid is undergoing a fundamental transformation driven by the spread of solar and wind power and battery energy storage systems. This transformation is creating new vulnerabilities to attack. Yet if we can secure these new devices, we also have an opportunity to transition to a fundamentally stronger resilience strategy to defend the grid and make sure that we can counter the objectives of our future adversaries. Wind and solar generation is usually termed renewable generation, but increasingly the electric industry is using a different term, that is, inverter-based resources. Inverters are the electronic devices that convert the direct current power that's provided by solar panels into alternating current, which is what the grid uses. Wind turbines and battery energy storage systems also largely rely on inverters to function. Inverter-based resources have provided a reliable and much-needed source of power during the current heat dome. I live in New Mexico, so I'm living it. I think that they'll continue to be valuable in future extreme weather events. But these resources also have significant opportunities to attack the grid. My written testimony references a terrific new study by the Department of Energy that lays out these vulnerabilities, and two stand out to me. First, adversaries can seek to access IBRs, inverter-based resources, and shut them down precisely when we need the power the most. Secondly, they can attempt to seize control of inverter-based resources and misoperate them, and above all, to use their new abilities to help control frequency and voltage in order to create widespread disturbances. They can use what's supposed to be an advantage, transform it into a weapon. The Department of Energy study focuses on distributed energy resources, and that is IBRs that are tied to distribution systems. But increasingly, the bulk power system also has inverter-based resources tied to high-voltage transmission systems. So system-wide, we've got some new potential vulnerabilities to get out in front of and get ready to secure the grid of the future. Fortunately, there's a strong regulatory and technical foundation to build security into the future grid. IBRs that are tied to the bulk power system have to comply with the mandatory reliability standards and infrastructure protection standards that NERC has already established. And NERC and its partners are already exploring new mechanisms, new potential regulatory requirements to help secure IBRs. And there's progress at the distribution level. As all of you know, distribution systems are regulated by state authorities, including public utility commissions, who are responsible for those systems. Industry is developing standards for cybersecurity for IBR at the distribution level, And the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, NARUC, is already advocating for the adoption of IBR-related standards. So we've got a great head start on securing the grid of the future. But the process is far from complete, and that's why I'm so grateful for the opportunity to testify before you today. There's lots to be learned still about the vulnerabilities that IBRs are going to create at the systemic level. We need to develop risk-based, cost-effective ways of mitigating these risks that focus on strength and resilience against high-consequence events. We need to leverage the expertise of the private sector, including device manufacturers, standard-setting organizations, and the owners and operators of the power grid. And finally, we need to take advantage of the new resilience strategies that the spread of IBRs and grid decentralization can make possible. In my written testimony, I mentioned a couple of these options to build a stronger, safer grid thanks to IBRs, and I've also suggested how we can tailor these strategies to counter the objectives that China and other potential adversaries are likely to try to achieve by attacking the grid. Mr. Chair, Ranking Member, thank you for the opportunity and the privilege to testify.
Thank you, and that ends our testimony from our witnesses this time. We will move into the question and answer portion of the hearing, and I will begin the questioning and recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Walker, loved your testimony, loved all of your testimony, but was intrigued by a couple of things that you said. One, sounded like maybe we ought to rely a little bit more on coal because you don't need pipelines to transport coal. And coming from a coal district, that was music to my ears. Did I understand that correctly, or were you just advocating that we do better on the pipelines?
I actually advocate for an all-of-the-above approach.
There you go. And I agree with that. Then also, you talked about the large transformers, and we floated some ideas around here, and we've got some ideas right now in front of us. But part of that is the processing of steel used in making transformers for electric transmission and so forth. And new regulations from the EPA are actually going to hurt us in that regard, aren't they? They may make us a little bit more efficient, but it's going to make it harder for us to actually produce the transformers. Isn't that true?
Not exactly.
All right, fill me in.
What you're talking about actually affects distribution transformers, not the large power.
Not the large ones, okay.
Yeah, the large power transformers I'm talking about are substation level. So they transition transmission level voltage down to distribution.
Down to distribution level. But then the distribution's made harder if we have the slight efficiency upgrade. Is that correct?
Well, there's, what you're talking about with regard to the proposals that are being used for amorphous core transformers are highly dependent on the situations that are being utilized, when those transformers are being utilized, especially where you look at the loading on the transformers. So given the other threats we have on the system, the focus on this is really de minimis with regard to the efficiency gain you would get. Normally, the efficiency gain that they talk about with amorphous core transformers deals with no load testing. When you get into higher load testing, there's actually there's different magnetizing currents that actually deal with and make amorphous core less efficient. So it's highly dependent on the situation that the distribution transformer is actually being utilized for. I would offer that the timing of it is subject to debate, given the fact that right now there is a supply chain shortage with distribution transformers. And I think the bigger issue that's being realized is that the manufacturers who are willing to expand their businesses and increase the number of transformers they're producing, which is necessary given all the investment we're putting into the system, they need clarity that they're not going to make millions and millions of dollars of investment for the existing processes that are utilized, and then be told that 4 years from now they can no longer make normal transformers. And so nobody's making the investment that would necessarily increase the production rate at this point. So really what the industry needs, the manufacturing industry, is clarity on which direction we're going so that they can make the appropriate investments to expand their capability to make these transformers.
So you think Mr. Hudson's bill is a good bill that says let's put a hold on all these new regs coming out for about 5 years or more?
I do.
All right, I appreciate that. Let's talk about all of the EV charging stations. What risks do you all see? And I'll start with Mr. Chanowski. What risks do you see with all the EV stations? Are they putting in the proper requirements or the proper equipment to prevent a cyber attack on each of those stations?
Thank you. That's a great question, particularly seeing as the significant increases that we're expecting and forecasting for transportation electrification are coming at us so fast that the grid almost is going to be challenged to keep up with it. From a cybersecurity perspective, Idaho and some of the other national labs have done a significant amount of testing of commercial EV charging infrastructure, and the assessed outcomes of that is not a lot different than any other product. There is not a digital product that is invulnerable. All systems are technologically. There are a number of different standards that are emerging in the space that, again, there's some overlap right now, and it remains to be seen which set of standards will be the final one that's adopted. But they exercise the same sorts of general good practice cybersecurity design standards that we seek to put into them.
Let me shift gears slightly. The issue was raised a couple of times over the last year in meeting with different people that if we have particularly the fast chargers, for lack of a better term, that are used out there, that those actually, if a huge number of people are driving electric cars, that could actually pull the grid down. Have y'all done any work on that?
Yes, there have been a number of studies by many different organizations, and it's an engineering problem. And if you put too much load on the grid in too short of a time window, it absolutely will, according to laws of physics, drag the grid down until some part of it collapses.
And I've run out of time, but are we prepared to deal with that in the next couple of years, or is this something that's going to take us longer to fix?
We have the engineering to know how to do it. It's a question of forecasting where it's going to be and finding the resource to actually build it.
All right. Appreciate it very much. I yield back now. Recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for her 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks again to our witness for your expert testimony today. This is a good time to be examining the emerging threats because now, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we have very significant resources going through the Department of Energy to grid organizations, utilities, tribes, states, et cetera. Over the past few months, they have really began, the Grid Deployment Office especially, rolling out a lot of the grants to enhance reliability and resilience in grid infrastructure and also harden and weatherize the grid and for cybersecurity. Dr. Stockton and Mr. Walker, have you watched where these grants are going? Just yes or no to start off.
No, not in detail.
No?
I've seen what's been publicly provided by DOE.
Okay. This is my question because there are enormous resources now that will be coming out over the coming years. As you look at it, the initial funding in partnership with all of the partners, are you seeing what you need to see and where can they improve?
I think the work they're doing is nascent, and I think as they continue in the process, I think the opportunity they have is to really try to identify through engineering means the best strategical use of where to put these resources. I applaud Congress for the IIJ funding, the IRA funding, because I think it is a generational opportunity to make the investments in the grid. I think if we put them in these battery storage, the DERs, in places that make strategic sense, right, that shore up the physics of the system for reactive power, fluctuations on the system, then we have really utilized that money as effectively as we possibly could.
Thank you. So, Dr. Stockton, it was interesting, in the NERC reliability report that just came out, and their first key finding is the threat to reliability is extreme weather events. But then just like you highlighted in your testimony, one of the following key findings, solar, wind, and battery energy storage systems are inverter-based resources. They rely on inverters. You've highlighted in your testimony that this, while it holds great promise, in the clean energy transition, it does open up additional vulnerabilities. What do you recommend specifically for Congress as we watch the Department of Energy roll out these very significant investments in hardening the grid and ensuring reliability? What do we need to precisely be watching when it comes to these new resources?
Thank you. As with the FAST Act and the other terrific ways in which this committee and the members here have helped guide investments in resilience and focus on those highest consequence events, we have an opportunity to do so here. So helping ensure that we have a risk-managed approach to this, and above all, ensuring that at the level of the devices, that we hold manufacturers' feet to the fire and ensure the adoption of safe and secure inverters instead of relying on individual utilities or energy aggregators or other entities within the larger electric system to do their own homework. We have an opportunity to work with the private sector to build security into these devices so that when they're procured by local distribution companies or at the bulk electric system level, they can't be intentionally misoperated by China or other potential adversaries, and they can't be shut off at a whim at a time and choosing of our adversary.
Thank you very much. Mr. Walker, you know, we can kind of digest the hostile nations trying to interfere with our grid. But what the heck with domestic extremists? What is going on really with the white nationalist movement attacking transformers across America? What's behind this? And it's been interesting to watch the FBI get to work on this. But can you explain what their motivation is, what they're trying to achieve?
I think the motivation of the DVEs at every level, including whatever falls into that bucket, is that physical destruction works. People understand how to do it. The means to do it are readily accessible, and so DVEs are aware of, and I think NERC's report highlighted this. It's a continuing evolution of threat on the public of the United States. And what their motivation is, I think, is simply that they want to shut the lights down.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the chairwoman of the full committee, Ms. McMorris Rodgers, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I noted in my opening statement, we do know that the Chinese Communist Party has increasing capabilities to disrupt our operations, critical infrastructure, and this imposes an immediate and immense threat to our national security. So I wanted to start with you, Mr. Cancel. How do increasing tensions with China impact EISAC's work and affect its efforts to coordinate security activities and information sharing with the electric sector?
Thank you for the question. Excuse me. Certainly, we follow all geopolitical activities, but certainly the Chinese activities, as I mentioned in my testimony, are quite alarming. And China, again, continues to demonstrate how patient they are, how stealthy they are, and as you've seen in recent attacks, they're actually quite adept at obfuscating what they're trying to do. In the recent Volt Typhoon campaign that's gone on, in fact, they made mention of sort of just getting into the network and what we call living off the land. So observing what's going on in the network and looking for vulnerabilities that they could exploit. So accordingly, this remains a huge area of focus. And we work, I mentioned the ETAC earlier with the Department of Energy. It's an area of focus there. So we work closely with them and the intelligence community to understand the true nature of these threats and get information out to our members, as well as mitigation steps that they should take. And we'll just continue to monitor and make sure that we are doing everything we can to protect ourselves from those threats.
Would you speak in a little more detail as to what the plan is to address this challenge in the next months and years?
So there's a couple of things, right? So one is maintaining a strong cybersecurity program, right? And that's something that we reinforce with our members all the time because that goes a long way towards protecting all critical infrastructure sectors. Working with the intelligence community to get information about the specific threats and disseminating that information as quickly as possible. Providing very clear and concise mitigation measures that utilities can follow, regardless of the size of the utility, steps that they could take to protect against those threats. Those are the major things that we would focus on as we go forward.
So are you seeing more threats from China or Russia?
Probably China right now, but, it's not consistent, and Russia, especially since the invasion of Ukraine, continues to be a very complex adversary that has the capabilities as well. We saw that demonstrated in 2015 and 2016 when they knocked out power in Ukraine and used those techniques to do that, and that those could be leveraged here as well. We've made sure that the sector is aware of those techniques and has taken steps to protect against them. But to answer your question, they both have the capability, and we see a lot of activity from both of them.
Okay, I wanted to get some questions to the others also, because clearly critical infrastructure is foundational to our telecommunication systems, our drinking water, hospitals, many other essential services rely upon the electric sector for their day-to-day operations. So I was going to start with you, Mr. Cancel. You mentioned that EISAC plays an important role in the cross-sector coordination. What type of activities are you doing to encourage information sharing and coordination among the other sectors? And how do we address, the silos of industry and government?
So the first is both formal and informal interaction with the other cross-sector ISACs and communities, right? Sharing threat intelligence information, understanding what they're doing from a risk mitigation perspective, learning from that as well, too. Conducting mutual drills. So I mentioned Grid X, which is a drill that we conduct every 2 years, and we include the other critical infrastructure sectors just for that reason. So we can understand what they're seeing from a threat perspective and leverage solutions that they may be able to bring to bear as we go forward. So that dialogue has to continue and does continue on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, Mr. Walker, you noted in your written testimony that your nonprofit analyzes the cyber and physical risk for all critical infrastructure sectors. How does the reliance on these other sectors, on the electric sector, influence your work and how you approach electric grid security activities?
Thank you for the question. The most important other critical infrastructure sector for the electric grid is the telecommunication sector. And we've looked extensively at the communications that are utilized throughout the United States. And there have been conclusions that have identified that our reliance on commercially available communications presents a significant risk to our ability to operate the system, given that the communications compromise is what enables the cyber actors like China to actually touch many pieces of the equipment. And in fact, the $1.9 billion that was authorized by Congress for the rip and replace strategy for ZTE and Huawei, which, by the way, was oversubscribed, as I mentioned in my testimony, up to $5.6 billion, has only spent $41 million to actually remove these pieces of equipment from our system. So we have in excess of $5 billion sitting of these, potentially compromised pieces of equipment sitting on our system that are being relied upon by many critical infrastructures, but especially by some of the electric utilities throughout the United States.
Thank you. Thank you. We're working on getting rip and replace done too. But thank you, everyone, for being here. I yield back.
Wow, thank you. I now recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Chanowski, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this conversation is important about the electric grid protection and resilience strategies, but I also want to talk more generally a little bit about the climate crisis that we're all experiencing right now. Yesterday, we had an air quality alert. Over the East Coast has had deadly floods, and over the weekend, a third of Americans lived in a heat dome, and we were reaching unheard of the temperatures. And last week I introduced a resolution called the Children's Fundamental Rights and Climate Recovery Resolution. And I'm concerned about the children. I want to ask Dr. Stockton, what does the future look like for our children and future generations if we fail to weatherize the grid and address climate change?
Well, a crucial way to address climate change is to support the continued deployment of wind, solar, and other zero-carbon generation. My argument today, though, and my hope with the committee's workload, is that we can do so in a way that helps strengthen overall resilience against man-made threats as well as Mother Nature in order to improve the sustainability of life for the United States and its partner nations over the long haul. So we can do both. We can maintain an appropriate mix of generation. I think natural gas-fired generation has always got to be part of the mix for various reliability reasons. But as we transition to other zero-carbon sources of electricity, that's going to be great for our children, ultimately great for our economy, and great for survivability against China and other potential threats.
Thank you. You answered the question of what is the overall thing that we have to do all the time, and I agree with you. Mr. Cancel, what do you think that Congress should be doing right now to help build a more resilient and reliable grid for tomorrow? What is our role?
Well, thank you for the question, and I think we've spoken about, some of the initiatives that are underway, so building on some of the work that's been done by the recent acts. Again, I think, as Mr. Walker said, a whole-of-society approach, sort of helping us to continue to share information not only across the electricity sector, but across critical infrastructure sectors. As regulations are developed, making sure that those regulations aren't duplicative and harmonized across, the various arms of the federal government. So it's easy for critical infrastructure organizations to comply with those regulations. And those regulations actually strike the balance between assessing the risk and have a cost-effective mindset as we go forward. So I would say continue doing more of what we've just talked about, particularly as it relates to ensuring resilience and reliability.
Thank you. Let me go back to you, Dr. Stockton. Are we seeing sufficient support from the private sector as well as the government sector in moving in the direction that you're saying, in developing more alternative energy sources, clean energy sources, and then what can we do as members of Congress to encourage all of that?
Well, the innovation by the private sector is astonishing and much needed. And the owners and operators of America's grid, equipment manufacturers, everybody else that's a resilient stakeholder, we need everybody achieving what I used to call in the Pentagon unity of effort. That is, across the regulatory divides, across the different components of the energy sector, and with the strong support of Congress, we need to work together in order to achieve resilience. But absolutely, the private sector is leaning very far forward in the development of new energy resources, as well as working with the Department of Energy and regulators to help secure, for example, as Secretary Walker said, the flow of natural gas that China for sure is preparing to target.
So do you want to suggest what are the greatest shortcomings, the greatest shortcomings that need to be addressed, that we should be thinking about right now, first in line?
Well, we need to ensure that wind power in particular is generated in parts of the United States where there are very few customers. We can get that generated power to where it needs to be, to where the big loads are. So build out of transmission is critical. Other infrastructure, we need to go forward to address that. But we also need to look over the horizon. I've talked about some of the emerging threats that will become stronger and stronger as we build the grid of the future. Let's not forget about artificial intelligence as a critical enabler for Chinese attack planning and execution, and what it's going to take on our side to strengthen our automated defenses when these attacks are coming at us at a speed and a scale that humans are not going to be fully prepared to address.
So technologically, we're not.
Gentlelady.
Oh, I'm sorry. I yield.
Gentlelady's time is up, and she yields back. Now recognize Dr. Burgess of Texas for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right, Dr. Stockton, you got my attention when you said the Chinese were going to interrupt the natural gas supply. What did you mean by that?
There's intelligence community reporting that China is intentionally targeting natural gas transmission pipeline systems for disruption. Secretary Walker, in his testimony, mentioned the National Intelligence Report from last year. There's been sustained reporting that this is a target for attack. Now, that doesn't mean it's time to panic. That means it's time to collaborate with the owners and operators of natural gas infrastructure and strengthen the collaboration between the ONG subsector and the electricity subsector to build shared resilience. Natural gas fire generation is a critical contributor to reliability, so let's treat it as a target for resilience investment.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In our HR 2 that we passed earlier this year, part of that was the siting for pipelines for natural gas from the Permian Basin to the parts of the world where the gas is consumed. You referenced the wind blows a lot in parts of the world where few people live. We experienced in the district that I represent, that's just north of the DFW airport, the competitive renewable energy zones that Governor Perry had created from West Texas to bring the energy east to Dallas-Fort Worth, but they had to put the transmission lines through somewhere, and that somewhere was the backyards of people in my district. So I heard a lot about it at the time. But then the same is true on natural gas, because there is a lot of natural gas that is produced in the Permian that cannot be immediately used. Unfortunately, some is vented, some is flared. We need to end that. But at the same time, that is product that needs to go either to the large metropolitan areas in the east or to the terminals where it can be liquefied and shipped offshore. So I really appreciate your comments along those lines, and you're right, this does take a whole of government approach. Now, Mr. Walker talked a little bit about on the transformers and the lack of transformers. Are there similar problems with your inverters, Mr. Stockton, Professor Stockton, that you were talking about? Do we have a satisfactory supply of inverters for all of the renewable energy that's being brought into the grid?
Well, I'm going to open up a rabbit hole for us to chase down. Manufacturers in China are important producers of inverters being deployed nationwide across the United States. And I think looking at supply chain risks, not just availability of critical products, but the risks that China will exploit these products in order to conduct attacks on the grid, I'm hopeful that the committee will continue to address these supply chain risks. Right now, sure, we've got inverters. Some of them are made in China. Others may be manufactured for final assembly in friendly nations, but they might have components, hardware, software, and firmware that could provide attack vectors. And the constant updating of firmware from the cloud and by service providers, who's on top of that for maintaining adequate security? Congressman, that's an opportunity for progress.
So that's the, when you talk about the vulnerabilities in the inverters, that's to what you were referring? Mr. Chairman, I think that we could spend some time on that, and I hope we will in the future. What about, could you just comment on the best practices that stakeholders are using to ensure that all parties are collaborating to maximize the resilience and reliability in essentially for the inverters, but the grid generally?
There's terrific collaboration going forward. And Congressman, let me cite one that I'm especially grateful for, and that is close coordination between NERC, which is responsible for mandatory standards for the bulk power system, and NARUC, and Public Utility Commissioners, which in your district and others across the nation have authority over distribution level systems. We don't want to have a regulatory divide between one set of regulators and another. We need close collaboration which respects the authorities of both sets of regulators. And that progress is going forward. We need more of it. As we turn to the threats, potential threats posed by electric vehicles, we're going to need that community in. And Mr. Chairman, I think it was you who said, how about the Internet of Things? What risks are we acquiring there? So if you look at the collection of important stakeholders that need to be brought together, Congressman, in order to be able to build an integrated, holistic approach to security. Boy, that's a long list,
Yeah.
and progress is underway.
So I'm old enough to remember the Aurora vulnerability that we heard about in this committee 15 years ago.
Yes, sir.
A regulatory divide is something we never encounter in the federal government. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope we can spend some time working on that. Thank you for your testimony. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from California, Dr. Ruiz, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. One threat I want to make sure doesn't go unnoticed is the inaccessibility of power for rural communities. For those with infrequent or unreliable access to power, it feels like the next power outage could happen at any day, any moment. Grid security is intertwined with these reliability concerns, and we need innovative solutions that prioritize efficiency, affordability, and accessibility to improve stability. Microgrids are one of those innovative solutions with the potential to bring grid security and reliability to communities that currently lack reliable grid access, particularly in rural areas, and communities that experience extreme weather. Microgrids are self-sufficient energy systems serving smaller areas, colleges, for example, college campuses, hospital complexes, neighborhoods, homes. They are hyperlocal, regional, and for rural communities like those in my district, these local solutions can be life-changing. As a representative of district with rural communities that experiences unreliable access to power due to weather conditions, extreme heat and others, it is important that even the most isolated neighborhood has reliable energy. We've seen the effects of the Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, where most of the IV fluids is manufactured. When one system goes down, it all goes down. And imagine if we had reliable microgrids in different areas, then at least the whole power outage problem could be prevented, and we could still have some sustainability of critical manufacturing and critical industries during natural disasters. Dr. Stockton, what are the benefits of having an energy grid that is supplemented and supported by local solutions like neighborhood microgrids or decentralized battery storage?
Those benefits are enormous. And congratulations on the progress that's being made in your communities in order to ensure that hospitals, water systems, other infrastructure that's absolutely vital for saving and sustaining lives can continue to function even if the surrounding power grid goes down. That's a crucial way of going forward. And I would say in many cases, having distributed electricity produced by wind and solar is part of the way of making that way forward. Thank you.
Thank you. My district produces the most renewable energy on federal land than any district in the nation. Mr. Chanowski, what are some of the security challenges that adopters of microgrids might face, and how can we make sure that these adopters are aware of new and existing security challenges facing microgrids?
Sure, thank you. And I'll second Dr. Stockton's thanks for what you're doing for these folks that face these challenges. From the security perspective, from a technical perspective, there is not an appreciable difference in the technology and the material and the systems. Where it is different, though, is because that rural location and that sort of remote access provides some additional systemic vulnerability that might make them more susceptible to an attack, such that their consequences could be more severe. You know, if that microgrid is disabled, it's not a simple matter of reconnecting to the grid, as you well know. So from that perspective, that puts perhaps an even increased importance on the focus of correctly designing, testing, operating, and maintaining these systems throughout their life cycle to ensure that these benefits that they provide are available when they're needed.
Thank you. You know, unfortunately happening in my district this week is a heat dome that will apply pressure to our regional grid. We have about, when I was there this weekend, it was 116. Local public health officials across the country are urging people to seek cooler shelter. Furthermore, blackout in any area of my district can be life-threatening, and as climate change continues to heat up the planet, we must prepare for immensely hot temperatures. And so by investing in microgrids, we can avoid blackouts altogether. And to do this, we must ensure that each resident has the resources available to install solar panels and battery storage to power their homes or businesses. I look forward to seeing the Infrastructure Investment and the Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act investments helping underserved rural areas reliably access the grid and deploy microgrids. I'm pleased that today the Department of Energy announced that they will be providing $14.7 million for microgrid solutions for underserved and indigenous communities. My district will certainly benefit from the new investment. Mr. Council, are there additional steps that Congress can take to guarantee investments in grid security that will account for threats to microgrids meant to benefit underserved rural communities?
I think they're already being, well, thanks for the question first, but I think those steps are already being taken in terms of increasing resilience. And as you pointed out, recognizing the opportunities to make sure that as we leverage microgrids, we do it in a resilient and secure way. One of the things that we do at the EISAC is also recognizing the diversity of the electricity industry in the United States. It's not just big investor-owned utilities. Actually, 500 of our members are small municipality-run utilities and co-ops with different capabilities and, as you mentioned, different challenges. I think addressing those challenges through the legislation that's put forth, the funding opportunities that are put forth, provide an opportunity to address those concerns.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and now recognize Chairman of the Health Sub, Mr. Guthrie, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, and I apologize for not being here. A couple of other hearings going on as well, so we're not from the lack of interest, it's from trying to cover all the hearings we need to cover, so I'll get right to my questions. So Mr. Chanowski, and a couple others, I may also ask Mr. Council something on this. Electric and other utility providers across my district, they're concerned about cyber attacks, and just last year there was a municipal utility in my district that disrupted service for about 18 hours because of a ransomware attack. And so, Mr. Chanowski, are there any particular gaps in cybersecurity research, demonstration, testing, or knowledge that you'd like to flag for us today, or think that should receive increased focus about what's going on with some smaller producers?
Thanks, sir. And I think that probably the biggest challenge gets to the resources, and it's not just about the dollars also, but about the access to the workforce with the correct skills and experience to be able to implement some of these solutions. When we talk about the threats from ransomware, the collective wisdom and the knowledge of industry and government has an effective approach to protecting against ransomware from designed and maintained solutions that are quite effective. Now, getting the opportunity and the resources to integrate that into a system that is 24/7 on all the time, that's some of the biggest challenge right there. So it's not necessarily what do we do, but it's how can we actually take action to implement this where it's needed across a very wide swath of
Do you think the knowledge to address it is there in the technology? It's a matter of getting it implemented, or is there still we're still trying to figure out how to stop it? So knowing how to stop it, and as you just said, is it more knowing how to stop it or being able to stop it? Two different.
I would, from those two, it's probably being able to stop it, right? Because we have identified, and many institutions have implemented effective technical protections and organizational processes against ransomware, the ability to recover if there was a gap in some of those, a very important part of that. So it's with that, it's not so much of a necessarily, I think, a research question as it is an actual application question.
But I would think, and this, I'm just, that these guys would adjust the bad guys always kind of, or you got to kind of keep up with them. So that'd be my concern, is that we haven't perfected stopping them, but we've stopped what we know is out there, right? Or do you think we're ahead of it?
No, your assessment is very good. And we are not able to prevent everything. A well-determined, well-resourced adversary is going to create their effects. But what we can do by implementing some of these known and sensible and good practice defenses is we raise the cost to the adversaries to do it, which may affect their calculus of what they actually choose to do and who they choose to target.
Okay. I was going to ask you, Mr. Council, about that, but I'm going to switch to something different, if that's okay. Your written testimony notes unmanned aerial surveillance vehicles, or drones, as another critical infrastructure concern. Are you aware of any increase in security incidents involving drones, and has there been concern from the electric industry regarding the use of drones by malicious actors? And Mr. Walker, if you'd like to talk about that as well, I think. But if you want to go, Mr. Counsel, first.
So not aware of any specific attacks that have leveraged drones to damage critical infrastructure here. But that being said, we are aware of drones being used to conduct surveillance around critical infrastructure plants. And as a result, one of the things that we've been working on is a pilot that is actually tracking drone activity around critical infrastructure and sharing that with our members. The challenge with drones is that they're used, for quite productive activities as well, inspections, storm restoration. So understanding how they're being used and when that use case might be malicious is really the opportunity there. And then taking steps to protect against any activity that a drone could take to damage the infrastructure.
Okay, Mr. Walker?
Thank you for the question. I think, as Mr. Cancel pointed out, the use of drones has significantly increased, but, and in many good ways, and they're used throughout the United States by our own utilities for, reliability purposes and surveillance of the system. But similarly, they can be used in nefarious ways by bad actors, DVEs in particular, who have physical access to locations to attempt to do and cause physical destruction in the United States.
Yeah, because people have drones for so many reasons. For a reason, I was having a drone to kind of film me doing something along the Green River. Right across the river was Paradise, which is the big TVA gas plant. It used to be a coal plant. But anyway, so I didn't think about it till you were just talking. I wonder if somebody's wondering why I was flying a drone around, or somebody was flying a drone around following me. So anyway, thank you for your testimony, and I will yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back, and now recognize Mr. Peters for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a tough problem. We have infrastructure that's aging. It wasn't built for resilience, really. We've got extreme weather like wildfires, floods, all of which threaten the energy grid. We made unprecedented investments in America's grid last Congress. I wrote the Power On Act, which was included in the bipartisan infrastructure law, which will help build high-capacity transmission lines between states and regions. That'll give grid operators greater flexibility in times of crisis, but also help reduce electricity prices and promote economic development as energy demand continues to rise. This Congress, I hope we can build on that progress and enact additional reforms to build a modern, secure electrical grid. Yesterday, we introduced the FASTER Act with Representatives Vesey and Cardenas. That bill will give the FERC stronger federal siting authority for large, high-voltage transmission lines, streamline the environmental review process, and incentivize community benefit agreements to facilitate more local support for transmission lines along the way. And I hope that this committee will continue discussing and advancing bipartisan reforms to make the grid more efficient and more secure. Mr. Walker, can you tell us how high-voltage transmission connections among regional grids might give grid operators more flexibility to prevent blackouts during a crisis, particularly in regions that rely heavily on a few separate technologies?
Sure. From going back to my work in the Office of Electricity within DOE, we looked extensively at building out the transmission system for the exact purposes you identified, and there is no question about the added resilience in the system if there's additional transmission lines, high-capacity transmission lines that are able to bring things like the renewable energies that Secretary Stockton spoke about earlier into areas that are highly, or have high density of load. I would offer that while that's also being done, the thing that I think needs to be added in and addressed more thoroughly is the utilization of high-capacity megawatt-scale storage. So while we're building out the transmission system, placing critical storage in those locations to help stabilize the grid and capitalize on storing some of the DERs throughout the system is a key component. And I know that the Pacific Northwest National Lab is working through the Grid Storage Launchpad on that specific issue, which we started as part of the study we were doing back in DOE when I was the Assistant Secretary there.
Very constructive. Several of the most interregional high-voltage transmission lines have taken years to build, some 15, 18 years to even plan. And according to analysis from Princeton, we have to build 200,000 miles of new high-voltage transmission lines by the 2030s. Over the last decade, we built just 1,800 miles per year. In 2021, we built 386 miles compared to 200,000 that we need. Mr. Walker, then I'll ask Dr. Stockton, what are the major roadblocks to building high-voltage transmission lines at the pace required to maintain an affordable and secure grid?
Thank you for the question. Based on my experience in this, it's really getting through the regulatory process. And so I think the legislation that will facilitate that will help. I would note that DOE previously was given that authority and capability and ran into significant legal challenges that had held up DOE's intervention in that. So I wouldn't be surprised that when FERC tries to apply these new authorities, they too will be at risk of dealing with legal challenges.
Of course, those laws are made in this building, and those laws can be
Absolutely.
amended in this building, and that's why I get on the plane every week. Professor Stockton, you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I agree with what Secretary Walker said. Let me also add, though, that a way of maneuvering around some of these impediments may be new technology that increases the ability of existing transmission lines to carry additional voltage, and potentially, over the longer term, the use of high-voltage direct current technologies to, again, move massive amounts of power to meet exactly the reliability and resilience roles that you identified.
Sure. Let's not avoid taking on a real problem, though, just because it's a hard legislative one. I mean, we should take advantage of all the technologies we can, but there's still this roadblock. And maybe Secretary Walker, maybe what reforms finally do you think we should consider in Congress to help build high voltage transmission lines faster?
Thank you for the question. I think you've done the most important thing through the funding mechanisms you've provided through the IIJ and the IRA. And I know with regard to the regulatory modifications that will be provided to FERC, that should go a long way in motivating this to get done in an expedited manner. And I think perhaps one of the considerations would be looking back on the authorities that DOE actually has in this space and using the legislative power to actually be very clear about their ability to address things like defense critical infrastructure, utilizing their capability to site transmission.
Right. And I'll let you know, as a climate action advocate, I think also we have to look at the length of time that litigation takes, and we have to constrain that significantly. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the Subcommittee Chair on Energy, who just, I don't know if you're finished yet or not, but had a hearing going on for hours this morning. Mr. Duncan of South Carolina.
5 hours and 20 minutes. Secretary Walker, I'm interested in the transmission line issue. Who should pay for these multi-state, interstate transmission lines, say taking wind energy from Iowa, sending it to California?
Thank you for the question. I think those that benefit from the utilization of those assets should be the people who pay. So through the FERC process, the rates that get established through the FERC initiatives should take that into account, but ultimately those who are going to use the power should pay for the power. It's a commodity.
Or the ones that are selling it maybe pay for it for delivery, but not.
Well, if the business case makes sense, then they'll do that,
I don't
right?
think it does right now, but you're right. It shouldn't be the states that the power lines cross that don't draw any benefit from it, correct?
Well, you know, what's interesting is we're dealing with a system that we've discussed here today that is the underpinning and the backbone of the United States. And it was developed through a monopoly system because of that. We've taken a system that was traditionally a monopoly and turned it into a business. And we're trying to make business decisions that comport with reliability, when the fact is that we should let physics decide how to make the most reliable, most resilient system.
I don't disagree with you on any of that. I guess what I'm talking about is there's this desire to push transmission permitting and cost allocation so that certain renewable producers can transmit that utility of that electricity generated somewhere to be utilized, not by the states that those power lines cross. So I'm asking, should, in the case of Iowa wind farms, California utilization, should Nebraska or Wyoming or Colorado or Utah pay the cost of that?
Well, I'll put it in a very
They don't draw
broad
any
term.
power off
Right.
of
If you need to bring your product to market, your commodity to market, then you should pay for the mechanism to do so.
That's the answer I wanted. Mr. Stockton, as you're aware, the vulnerability of industrial control systems to cyber attacks has become alarmingly clear in the past year. Cyber attacks on Colonial Pipeline, Solar Winds, Oldsmar water treatment facility have shown limitation of current ICS cybersecurity. The House version of this year's NDA included my amendment that authorizes the transfer of data and technology under DOD's more suitable awareness for industrial control systems program to local electricity providers. Both you and Mr. Chanowski have been familiar with this program as it was developed in partnership with APL and the Idaho National Lab. Can you expand on the impact of sharing this system that sharing this system will have? Mr. Stockton.
Thank you for the question. This is a terrific initiative. It's very important that the national security-oriented technologies that the Department of Defense is developing for the protection of military bases and power flows within them be shared with communities around the nation, because military installations cannot function without their surrounding communities. Very often they get their water service from surrounding communities. That's where people who work on the installation live, is in those surrounding communities. So we need to take a big picture bite at resilience and make sure that technologies that are developed inside the Department of Defense for its own use are broadly shared.
Yeah, great. Mr. Cancel, your testimony speaks to the merits of the Electric Information Sharing and Analysis Center addressing the continuously evolving threat environment. EISAC relies on members to involuntarily share information for EISAC to analyze and share for the benefit of this community. Does the lack of reliability protections deter utilities from information sharing or responding to eliminate an imminent cyber threat?
Thank you for the question. And certainly concerns about liability and attribution are inhibitors to information sharing. But that being said, over the last 3 years particularly, we've seen an increase in information sharing across utilities. And you know, the various incidents that I've discussed and threats that I've discussed, ransomware, physical security, we've seen a marked increase in information sharing across the sector. And I hope that that continues. But that being said, continuing to get our membership in a place where they feel it's safe to provide information, that's where we want to get to.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. I don't have any additional questions. Thanks, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Ms. DeGette of Colorado for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I kind of feel like the utility player today. Came from the Energy Subcommittee ranking member and now filling in for Ms. Castor, but I'm always happy to be here with you. You know, in addition to extreme weather increasingly stressing the energy grid, cyber attacks are becoming more prevalent and sophisticated. And so when these bad actors threaten an already stressed system, the consequences can be dire, as we all know. And the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act that we passed last Congress, it's going to help us to drastically reduce our carbon emissions so we can begin to bend the worst effects of climate change. But as the energy transition progresses, we need to make sure that our grid is safe from cyber attacks. So, Mr. Cancel, how can Congress best partner with the energy sector to identify and address cybersecurity threats as we move through this transition?
I think Secretary Stockton said it well before. Continuing to look at how we proactively build security into the grid of the future is the opportunity that's in front of us. The threats that I talked about in my testimony and others have spoken about are the same threats. Really what, you know, the new grid is going to increase is the attack vector, meaning the number of targets that can be potentially compromised. So again, all the more reason that we proactively build security into these devices and design the grid in such a way that it maintains security and reliability.
So DOE has established the Energy Threat Analysis Center, or ETAC, pilot at the National Renewable Energy Lab, which is just outside my congressional district, and we're very proud of. ETAC is helping to detect, prevent, and respond to threats to the energy sector, including cybersecurity threats. And so, Mr. Cancel, I'm wondering, how can Congress facilitate other initiatives like ETAC to help our energy grid against evolving threats, particularly in the cybersecurity space?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for the support of the ETAC. And I think the ETAC is a good model that can be extended to other critical infrastructure sectors as well. So as we share information across the board amongst those sectors, aggregating that information so we learn from each other and sort of put the correct actions in place. Encouraging participation, and this gets to the information sharing question, participation in venues like the ETAC, is important as well, too. And also making sure that we provide, regular status updates and readouts on what's going on in a forum like the ETAC to members of Congress and also state and local jurisdictions.
Is there anything more that Congress needs to do to effectuate all those things?
Well, there is legislation that is pending on the ETAC. I would say to evaluate that legislation, hopefully continue the support, and think about how we can leverage this construct more effectively going forward.
Great. Now, can you describe the grid infrastructure that's overseen by state or local officials and the cybersecurity vulnerabilities that can affect that infrastructure?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second question, which is it's the same cybersecurity vulnerabilities that we see in the bulk power system. So the threat actors don't discriminate between transmission and distribution. They will take advantage of whatever they can exploit, right? The NERC SIP standards apply only to bulk power transmission devices. But that being said, many utilities have taken those standards and applied them proactively to other assets. And again, not saying that standards are the answer to every problem here, but taking a look at this in a risk-based way, in a cost-effective way, is another opportunity to sort of look at how we protect distribution assets, inverter-based resources, and everything that will be on the grid of the future.
Okay, Mr. Chanowski, what should Congress consider when thinking about ways to address cybersecurity vulnerabilities affecting this type of grid infrastructure? Have you seen any novel approaches that could improve cybersecurity for the energy grid?
Thank you. And one of the approaches that I think has the most promise in my experience is something similar to what I did when I worked at NERC looking at reliability issues. And that is the notion of good root cause analysis and trending the causes, identifying commonalities so that you can share them out. It's a model the technical differences between the applications, of course, but very similar to what the National Transportation Safety Board does with their Aviation Safety Reporting System, ASRS, which has dramatically improved the safety of commercial air transportation over the last several decades. I think there's a lot of promise for something like that, looking at cybersecurity for energy systems as well.
Great, thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize Mr. Palmer of Alabama for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for the opportunity to discuss this very important topic, considering the fact that we may have whole sections of the country experiencing brownouts and blackouts as a result of insufficient generation capacity. NERC put out a report listing the top threats to our power grid, and I know there's been a lot of discussion about cyber attacks, rightfully so, but their number one risk assessment was changing the resource mix, that is, shutting down the hydrocarbon power generation at such a rapid rate and trying to replace it with renewables. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that and where we're headed over the next 10 years, because I don't think we're going to be able to replace that generating capacity with renewables in that time frame. Let's start with Mr. Cancel.
Sure, thank you for the question. And I think we mentioned it before, but it is really looking at the strategic replacement of the fuel mix. And again, certainly there's benefits to sort of addressing it from a climate change perspective, but again, as the NERC report illuminated, we're really focused on ensuring reliability, right? So retiring assets that would put the grid in a compromised state is not something that we're recommending or advocating for.
Yeah. How about you, Mr. Chanowski?
I would agree with Mr. Cancel. We have to be deliberate about this transition. We have to not resist the temptation to rush into failure, and also understand that it's not simply a replace X amount of megawatts of conventional generation with the same number of megawatts of renewable generation or distributed energy resources.
You're not going to be able to do that with renewables because you've got the grid issues and the land use issues.
Precisely.
If you were going to replace hydrocarbon generated power with something, I would be suggesting small modular nuclear reactors, because they're modular, they're manufactured, they can all your testing can be done in the factory, then retested once they're installed, and you don't have the land use issues, and they can fit just about any part of the grid. Wouldn't that make more sense than over the next 10 years as part of the transition to low emissions, no emissions?
Small modular reactors, I think, are going to be an incredibly important part of the transition. Idaho National Laboratory is the nation's nuclear laboratory looking at the research. And one of the other benefits of small reactor
why I asked
technology,
you.
thank you, is that these can be built on sites where you have retired generation, you already have access to the grid with the capacity that there will be more studies, but it's already not quite a plug and play, but the closest you're going to get at this scale.
Well, you have that with our nuclear fleet, pretty much plug and play. Now, their top generating capacity is 150, 200 megawatts on a aircraft carrier. But the interesting thing about using this model, and you get up to 300 megawatts with the SMRs, is that there's 6,200 reactor years without any accident. That's over a 50-year period. This should really assuage a lot of public concern about nuclear if we go to the small modular reactor units. And I want to ask you about something else, and this is something that we actually started talking about in 1994 when I ran a think tank. I worked for 2 international engineering companies prior to that and then ran a think tank. And we started talking about EMP attacks. And most of the people were focused on, you know, an adversarial nation doing that. But I've since become more concerned about an extreme event like a Carrington event. Are y'all familiar with the Carrington event?
Yes, sir.
And Lloyd's of London did an analysis of how it would impact North America if we had, or the United States in particular, if we had a Carrington-level event. And they think that, you know, possibly as many as 40 million people would be without power for a few weeks up to 2 years if we had an event of that level. What steps, if any, are being taken to harden the grid and our power generation against an attack, something like that happening? And the Carrington event is what most people would understand as a solar flare, but it's a coronal mass ejection of highly energized particles that literally in 1859 caused telegraph wires to catch on fire. So in the little bit of time that remains, could you address what we need to be doing and what's being done to harden our systems?
Absolutely. Very briefly, we have identified the most critical types of infrastructure, which are certain types of power transformers based on their design, so that we know where they're installed. And with that, we can plan around them so that you can use this as something that you can model, that you can simulate, understand the effects of, and you can have a plan for what would happen if we could do this. And sometimes you have enough time when one of these coronal mass ejection, these severe events are, that you do have a number of hours where you can adjust the system to be less susceptible to something like this. But we know where it is now based on those studies.
Mr. Chairman, considering Lloyd's of London, with their reputation, has done an analysis of the impact of what the impact could be, it's a bit shocking to me that Congress has not paid more attention to this, and I am very encouraged to hear what he just said, that the National Laboratory is looking into us. I thank you for your response. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Kamick, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for appearing before us today. And thank you to my good friend from the great state of Alabama for teeing up that EMP question. You beat me to it. So we'll just go down the line, starting with you, Mr. Cancel. First question, in your expert opinion, is an EMP a serious threat to our national infrastructure, particularly our electric grid? Yes or no?
Well, yes, but it depends on the type of EMP event that you're talking about. And so I would draw your attention to the EPRI report that was issued in 2019 that does a very good job of sort of categorizing the various EMP events, including the Carrington level type event that was mentioned, but also talks about less impactful events and also what can be done to sort of help prevent that. The other thing I'd offer is that the electricity industry has been studying this problem for a while now, and some utilities have been making substantial investments in hardening their infrastructure to protect against this. So sorry for a longer answer, but I thought it was important to mention that.
So a yes for Mr. Cancel, down the line.
I would agree with Mr. Cancel. It exists in the world. It's on the table. It's a possibility. The EPRI study and the engineering that's went around it has identified some ways that we weren't aware of before where there are some reasonable hardening approaches that can be employed.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. I apologize. Short answer.
It's a very complex question, and I think it's highly dependent upon a number of different scenarios to play out, but the EPRI report, as Mr. Cancel noted, highlights that it is a threat, so I'll go with a yes.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Stockton.
Yes, and the best way to manage this threat is to have an overwhelming nuclear deterrent.
I appreciate that. I'm going to stay with you, Mr. Cancel, talking about the production of transformers being completely dependent on a global supply chain and some of the issues that we see with the minerals and the components being mined and manufactured in places like China. In my mind, that's a problem. So would regulatory reform be the most immediate and impactful thing that we can do in Congress to draw those critical elements back into production domestically for our supply chain for things like transformers?
So I'll say yes, but I do think it's what we mentioned before, that taking a look at this strategically to ensure reliability across the grid and in the transmission system and the distribution systems is really the discussion that needs to take place to do that.
Thank you. Mr. Walker, same question to you, as quick as you can.
I do not believe that critical minerals that you're referencing are used widely in the development of transformers, so therefore they wouldn't really be applicable for
How about
slowing down.
inputs?
How about what?
Inputs in general.
You know, there's significant capability in this country to manufacture transformers, both distribution and large power transformers. It requires money, it requires investment, and by the federal government in the ability to put a stake in the ground with regard to what we believe is right. So we've talked about for years having a program for spare large power transformers in the United States. Heretofore, we have not established that in any meaningful way. And so we cannot produce in this country large power transformers that are over 450 megawatts because there's really not a market, and we've been buying we've been involved with a economic warfare, if you will, with places like China,
Yeah.
who grossly underpriced their large power transformers.
Absolutely.
And utilities throughout the United States, especially the federal governments, are forced through procurement laws to actually buy them.
Right.
So we've created a foreign market for these, and it's not economical, and we've driven down the profit margins in the United States such that it's just not a economically viable business.
Well, and I'm running short on time, so I want to get to you, Mr. Stockton. You mentioned something very interesting, AI. We have seen an explosion here in the last couple of years of the utilization of AI and what that means, not just for one sector, but all various industries. Certainly, adversaries like China would use this in an extraordinarily aggressive way. How can we utilize AI in a defensive means to protect and bolster firewalls and protect the grid?
The grid is already highly automated in many respects because of the speed with which operational decisions need to be made. We need now to begin to explore how we can harness these AI tools to further enhance our defenses and avoid the trap of relying on AI when China may be able to compromise those same tools.
Absolutely. My time has expired, so I will submit the remainder of my questions for the record. I appreciate you guys. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. She yields back. Now recognize the gentlelady and the vice chair of this subcommittee from Arizona, Ms. Lesko, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you for being here for quite some time. Mr. Chanowski, in your testimony, you included a consequence frequency chart of electric grid threats. Which threats should we put most of our resources into to prevent?
For prevention, I think you want to look at those high consequence, low impact type events on that vertical asymptote right there, the things that have truly catastrophic consequences.
Do you have the chart in front of you? Can you name off which ones you're talking about?
So that would be the targeted sabotage at the very top, insider threats, cyber attacks against operational technology, industrial control systems.
Okay. Mr. Walker, I went to the North Carolina substation site where there was a shooting. I noticed it was a chain link fence, and in Arizona, they usually have chain link fences around the substation. Do you think it would help to have a block wall around these substations where it's practical?
I don't think that the entire grid needs to have that type of protection. However, I do believe that there are highly important backbone corridors throughout our transmission system that hold each of the interconnects together. And I would offer that those corridors would be protected in a way that we protect nothing else in this country. Because what that would do is it would help us ensure that the system doesn't go completely black and enables us, therefore, to use those corridors to actually rebuild the system where it may otherwise be impacted through cyber or physical means. So the backbone corridors should be protected that way. It's impractical to protect the rest of the grid that way. There's over 10,000 transmission corridors in the United States. But if we distilled it down to the couple hundred that are really the most important, as well as the transmission corridors that are designated as defense critical electric infrastructure as required by the 2015 FAST Act.
And some of these protections, I've been told, are fairly expensive. So do you think that our government should invest in trying to protect some of these critical corridors?
I think the regulatory models actually exist that would enable the companies that do this to make the investment. I think the encouragement or partnership with the federal government would help facilitate that, or through NERC. In 2019, Chairman Chatterjee and I hosted a technical conference, joint technical conference when I was at DOE, with that in mind, with making investments in the grid and utilizing the FERC rate-making process to socialize it across the United States, because really we were making the investment for national security purposes, and therefore, because we were making it for national security purposes, we also contemplated that there should be a mechanism to be able to, like an adder, like a FCC adder type thing on people's bills, to provide that extra security on the system. So I think the federal government should do it, because we're talking about national security, and every citizen in the United States benefits from that. But there is tremendous opportunity, and there has been a lot of work done in this space with regard to the ability to protect these assets. I would note that there's a number of labs that protect, Lawrence Livermore, Sandia, that actually protect the nuclear weapons stockpile. And there's capabilities that we could glean from that mechanism and process, as well as work that Idaho National Lab has done in this space.
Thank you. When I was at the North Carolina site, we had a field hearing, and one of the questions I asked was about this block wall, and one of the answers was, well, you know, then drones would come in, right? And so my next question to you, Mr. Walker, would be, do you think that it's a good idea to maybe have no-fly zones for drones around substations or other critical infrastructure?
That's a possibility. I'm not sure how practical that is. I think one of the things we've looked at and talked about in the industry, I know in DOE we did significant research and developed capabilities for this, is actually using acoustic monitoring for drone detection, as well as being able to use it for detection of people or other, any noises. Monitoring at those substations is something that there is a plethora of ideas and capabilities and innovative solutions that can be utilized to better protect our substations throughout the United States. I think that the ones that really represent those critical backbones, we should spare no expense to make sure that they maintain, their viability, because of all of the things we've talked about here with regard to how important the electric grid is. We need those backbone corridors, and we need the DCI corridors so that we can project force, as Secretary Stockton noted.
Thank you, and my time has expired, so I yield back.
Chancellor yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our electric grid has increasingly faced physical threats that have the potential to compromise grid integrity, cause power outages, and damage critical infrastructure. These physical security threats vary in scale and source, but there is a consensus that we must prepare for them. The intelligence community and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency have raised alarm in recent years about the growth of domestic extremist groups, and we have seen white supremacists target grid infrastructure to advance their hateful agenda. At the same time, we need to remain vigilant against the physical security threats posed by foreign adversaries so that we are doing everything we can to help utilities and grid operators prepare for those threats. So, Mr. Cancel, you work with organizations across the energy sector. How do you approach the physical security threats to our grid from domestic extremists, and are there any threats that you or others have identified from domestic extremists that Congress could be helpful in addressing?
Thank you for the question. And so there's a lot that we do in this space to sort of ensure protections there. First is measuring and recording all the information that we have regarding physical security threats, so we can establish statistical trends and identify clusters where they're taking place. And sharing that information with the government, law enforcement at both the federal and local levels to sort of make sure they're aware of the critical assets that are in their jurisdiction, and then have a discussion about what can be done to protect against them. As it relates to DVEs, one of the things the ISAC does is we actually monitor open source intelligence, but also the dark web and other intelligence that's available, and we leverage our intelligence partners in the federal government to sort of get information about specific threats. So a good example of this is the Baltimore threat that took place, that was foiled, right? Where there was some intelligence that these adversaries were looking to do that. That needs to continue. The challenge there is that we have to be hyper-vigilant and look across all those intelligence sources and identify potential threats to do that. The other piece of that is making sure that we can tolerate, any activity that takes place, right? How do you make the grid more resilient, whether it's some of the physical security protection devices that have been talked about, those are the things. So helping to facilitate that, I think is important.
Thank you. And Dr. Stockton, you have dedicated your career to protecting our critical infrastructure from security threats originating from foreign adversaries. What are the most concerning physical security threats to our grid posed by our foreign adversaries, and what more should civilian organizations be doing to prepare for those threats?
Well, thank you for that question. The risk that we're facing is one of failure of imagination, or if you want to put it this way, shooting behind the target. There are potential nation-state adversaries that may seek to use physical attacks, including advanced physical attacks, against that backbone infrastructure that Secretary Walker was just discussing. So there are a variety of hardening measures that we can and should take, but I'd like to look at it a little bit differently, and that is ensuring the rapid restoration of power, even if these attacks on large power transformers or other critical assets are successful. We need to make sure that we have adequate large power transformers spares, stored securely, that we can transport them even in a contested environment when the nation's grid is under attack, to make sure we can rapidly restore power. That's a big part of the resilience equation, not only protection, but rapid restoration that prioritize savings and sustaining lives and make sure that our national security facilities and functions can continue to do what they need to do.
Thank you so much. And often it is impossible to fully eliminate the risk posed by physical grid security threats. That is why resilience is such an important part of mitigating risk. So, Mr. Cancel, how are utilities ensuring that Americans can keep their lights on even if they suffer an attack on grid infrastructure by domestic extremists?
So thanks for the question, and I think it's what you just said. It's looking at it, looking at the problem in a risk-based way, looking at the assets that they operate and evaluating the risks that are posed by those assets, and also thinking through how an adversary like a DVE would take advantage of that. And to that end, one of the things that the ISAC does is we help to facilitate workshops where we work directly with utilities to sort of walk through that, to do a threat assessment of particular assets, and then decide what, if any, additional steps should be taking place. I think that's taking place across the nation as we do that.
Thank you so much. Well, my time is just about expired, but I had some other questions that I'll get to the subcommittee to advance to the witnesses. So with that, I thank you for participating today, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bill for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you for allowing me to weigh on. Thanks for your friendship. This is a very important hearing. Again, it hits close to home for me. while the substation attacks in North Carolina and Washington received more national attention, there were at least 6 attacks to substations in the state of Florida, 3 of which were in the Tampa Bay area, and I represent parts of the Tampa Bay area. These weren't rural substations. Most were in urban or suburban areas. Mr. Counsel, question. You mentioned that the EISAC held a special webinar and briefing in response to the attacks in North Carolina. Did anyone, any of the Florida substation attacks receive similar briefings? And if not, do you think that the differences in the attacks, methods, and motivation warrant additional briefings?
So when we conducted that briefing, and when we typically conduct these type of briefings, we invite the entire electric sector. So we don't discriminate between participants. So I can't tell you if the utilities in Florida did attend. I believe they did. Our study, our analysis of security incidents absolutely calls out the incidents in Florida. And when you look at clusters, it's really the Southeast, North Carolina and Florida, where we had seen an increase in attacks. Moving forward, though, we've developed a resource guide for all our members that really points out simple steps they could take to conduct risk assessments and make investments to harden their assets. The last thing I draw your attention to is we're not declaring victory here. We have a series of workshops and road shows that we're calling to further discussion on physical security. They will take place regionally. One will take place in North Carolina, but we will invite all the utilities in the Southeast to participate. And we'll have similar ones throughout the United States as we go forward and continue to have that discussion. The last thing I'll draw your attention to is there is a technical conference that FERC and NERC are sponsoring on August 10th, where again, we will invite all the appropriate industry stakeholders to continue to further the discussion on what we can do to protect ourselves from physical security events.
Thank you. Consider coming to Florida, since it's the 3rd largest state in the union. Mr. Walker, I wanted to thank you for touching on the threat to our electrical energy infrastructure posed by the shortage of large power and distribution transformers. In Florida, we are prone to hurricanes, as you know, that can result in widespread destruction, God forbid, of our electrical grid and its critical components. In your written testimony, you mentioned the shortage as a solvable challenge. A very easy step to help would be for the Biden administration to reject its proposed rule on energy efficiency standards for distribution transformers. This rule would only worsen the existing shortage. We cannot wait until this shortage results in preventable deaths. We can't wait. Additionally, in your testimony, Mr. Walker, you listed a number of threats to the electric system, including the transition from an unidirectional to a multi-directional power flow grid. Can you please summarize some of the security risks that this transition poses, please?
Sure, thank you, Congressman Hudson. The transition presents, and I think it's been mentioned here before, a greater surface area for cyber and physical threat to be imparted upon. And so the system as designed and the control systems that we presently utilize and the processes we utilized were really designed for a top-down, from generation down to load. Things like the under-frequency load shedding that I mentioned in my introduction are very and highly effective when you have a system that is designed and operated that way. As you begin to integrate renewables, and I'm a fan of renewables, it's being strategically used throughout the system, but as you advance the integration of renewables, storage, all the other different components, the Internet of Things that utilize or provide capacity on the system, they introduce different communication pathways which enable cyber attacks to actually interfere with the effective and efficient utilization of those assets. So as we transition, and I think Mr. Chanowski talked about, you have to design the system. You have to design the control systems so that they're cyber secure by design. What we're doing is we're driving the bus and we're trying to change the tires while we're doing it. And so we need to think about all of the different changes and the multi-directional flows that we are now starting to see on the system that the system was not designed for. And our automated processes in some cases were not designed for. And so engineering concepts that were utilized in the past may not be applicable as we continue to further transform the grid.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it. And again, thanks for allowing me to wave on, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Bye-bye. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you for his time. And now recognize Ms. Harshberger of Tennessee for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to wave on as well. Thank you all for being here because this has been enlightening. This is something that I'm waved on because I'm interested in. I represent East Tennessee. We're not too far from Oak Ridge. And I've talked to Peter Pry in my office prior, when I first got here in 2020 about the EMP Commission report. But this question, I guess, can go to Mr. Cancel or Secretary Walker. Do you think that distribution transformers are critical to grid security? And do you agree that grid security is critical to national security?
Well, yes and yes.
Yes, very good. You can go down the line if you want to, or Mr. Walker.
I concur.
Okay, I think you all probably do. Do you know how long the lead time is for the procurement of a distribution transformer, Mr. Cancel or Mr. Walker? Or anybody on the?
My understanding is it's about 18 months.
Yeah. November, they calculated the lead time as 16 months, and I think that's far too long for a critical grid component. In June of last year, the Biden administration issued a declaration under the Defense Production Act stating that, quote, transformers and electric power grid components are industrial resources, materials, or critical technology items essential to the national defense. The declaration also stated that, quote, action to expand the domestic production capability for transformers and electric power grid components is necessary to avert an industrial resource or critical technology item shortfall that would severely impair national defense capability, end quote. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter the entire memorandum to the record. It's incredible to me after that proclamation that the Department of Energy under the same administration went on to upend the manufacturing of distribution transformers by noticing a rule to change the standards of transformer efficiency. And our supply chains were already in the middle of a shortage that the administration admitted was affecting our national security, only for a gain in an energy efficiency of a fraction of a percentage point. So we need to start thinking about risk to our grid and our national security when the administration makes rules regarding the efficiency standards of grid components. And maybe it's time to make some changes to protect our grid from the Department of Energy, which is an emerging threat by putting our grid and national security at risk. I'll change gears to the EMP. In 2019, President Trump issued executive orders, the Coordinating National Resilience to Electromagnetic Pulses, which set out responsibilities for several federal agencies regarding EMPs. And stakeholders agreed that high-altitude EMP attacks could jeopardize electric infrastructure, but experts disagreed on the specific level of risk and feasibility and need for hardening measures. So I guess my question to anybody on the panel is, what hardening measures would you suggest to mitigate that risk? Whoever wants to start. Yes.
So, ma'am, I can start from a very technical perspective, is that EMP has three components from the laws of physics. There's the E1 wave, that's the destructive one, and that's the one where it requires some things that are atypical. The E2 and the E3 effects have mitigations that largely are in place because they resemble the sorts of mitigations that we use for lightning, which is every day, and for geomagnetic disturbances, which are a known phenomenon that we built into our design. The sorts of protections would involve creating shielding around different types of components, whether it's at the device level or at the building, and making sure that that is configured and constructed and maintained in a particular way to be able to ameliorate some of those E1 electromagnetic pulse effects that happen in nanoseconds.
Yeah. So, yes, Mr. Stockton?
That's a great question. May I also add that we need to have survivable communication systems. So when power goes out, folks can go forward to substations and be able to communicate with their control centers. And so putting Faraday cages in a stored way around communications devices, push-to-talk, whatever you're using, that's a critical enabler against EMP.
You're speaking my language. We're already on the ham radio getting licensed and all that kind of thing, and Faraday cages are, listen, I'm in East Tennessee. Of course we do those things. So that is exactly correct. You want to add anything, Secretary?
No, ma'am. The 2 points that are raised are spot on. The one thing I would offer is in future design, there is the opportunity, and some companies are already doing this, to put in shielding protection at the substation level. Control centers are being built that are completely EMP proof.
Yeah.
And you know, when this is looked at, and we spent a significant amount of time within DOE taking a look at this, just a simple placement of and the orientation of a substation
Yes.
and the equipment makes sense. And things like the communication within the substation actually makes sense, right? Because you can shield it very easily in the trays that are already being utilized. So with small modifications, transitions from copper wire to fiber optics for communication inside the substation, things like that can be easily done. And there's a plethora of work that's been done at DOE to highlight some of these opportunities.
Yeah, but it's not everywhere yet, correct? So I know I am overtime. Oh, I'm overtime. Sorry, Morgan.
You're overtime.
Yeah, he's next to my district, so it's okay.
If the gentlelady could repeat the request for the unanimous consent, what the memorandum was?
Let me go back. It's a memorandum about the declaration that the Biden administration put in to change the way.
So it's
Yeah.
an administration memorandum?
Yeah.
All right, without objection?
Okay, thank you.
Then that will be inserted into the, they want to see a copy of it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll get one.
Thank you.
We've got it. Mhm.
All right. We'll then ask unanimous consent to insert in the record documents included on the staff hearing document list, which we will later create. Without objection, that will be the order. And we'll create that after you all have had a chance to take a look at it. Seeing there are no further members wishing to ask questions, I would like to thank our witnesses again for being here today. It has been very informative. We appreciate your time in informing us and the American people as to things that we need to be looking at to make sure that we have a secure grid. Pursuant to the committee rules, I remind members they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask that witnesses submit their responses within 10 business days upon receipt of those questions. Without objection, subcommittee is adjourned.